The private was 20 meters from the American foxholes when he decided the war was not worth another cigarette-less morning. He had rehearsed nothing except the 2 words he'd learned from a leaflet, and he crawled with his hands already half raised, elbows in the frozen mud of the Hurtgen, because a rumor had moved through his company faster than any order from battalion. The rumor said the Americans handed prisoners a full pack. Lucky strike, the green ones, or the white. It didn't matter to a man who hadn't tasted real tobacco since Aachen. And so, the thing that broke him at dawn on that ridge was not a barrage, not a flanking maneuver, but a promise printed on cheap paper and dropped from a low-flying plane. That shouldn't work. Armies do not collapse over cigarettes, and no manual on morale written in Berlin ever listed tobacco supply as a strategic vulnerability. Yet it did work, again and again, across the winter of 1944, and this channel exists to keep moments like this one on the record. So if a grenadier trading his rifle for a smoke tells you something about the war that the battle maps don't, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment with the small detail that changed how you understand it. The detail carries the whole argument here. Look at what that German soldier actually knew. He knew his own tobacco ration had thinned to a joke. A few loose cigarettes of reconstituted leaf and filler that his sergeants called Kommissbrot in a paper tube. And he knew it from experience, not propaganda. He'd smoked ersatz for 2 years. He knew what the Wehrmacht could give him, and he knew by the winter of that year that it could barely give him bullets. So when a leaflet promised American cigarettes on the far side of no man's land, he wasn't being fooled. He was doing arithmetic. The German High Command had a professional interest in that arithmetic, and they got it wrong for reasons worth explaining. Their intelligence people tracked Allied firepower, Allied air superiority, Allied fuel stocks, all the categories a serious general staff is trained to watch. Tobacco was not a category. It sat below the threshold of what a war ministry considers a weapon, filed under comfort, under morale, under the soft things you address when the hard things are handled. The Americans, by contrast, had folded tobacco into logistics at a level that would have looked absurd to a Prussian planner. Cigarettes shipped by the trainload, issued free, printed onto surrender leaflets as bait. One side treated a smoke as a luxury. The other treated it as ammunition, and the difference showed up on the ridgeline in the form of a man crawling toward capture. The Hurtgen was the worst possible place to test this. That forest ground down American divisions across 3 months of the ugliest fighting on the Western Front, a fight the U.S. Army's own historians would later describe in language that avoids the word victory. Cold that cracked rifles, tree bursts that turned pine trunks into shrapnel. Nothing about the Hurtgen favored a soft explanation for surrender, and that is precisely what makes the point land. If a leaflet promising Luckies could pull Germans out of that meat grinder, the leaflet was doing something artillery couldn't. And German officers noticed. They wrote about it after the war, in the interrogation rooms and the Foreign Military Studies program, and their word for it was not morale. Their word more than once was propaganda we could not answer. That phrase is the thread. A German general, filing a report for the U.S. Army Historical Division after the surrender, admitting there was an American weapon his side had no counter for, and the weapon was a cigarette. Not the Sherman, the P-47 working the tree lines, or the endless artillery, but a cigarette. to understand why the hands went up for a smoke, why a professional army that fought like cornered animals in that forest could be pried loose by tobacco. You have to go back to a decision made not on a battlefield, but in a supply office years earlier, about what an American soldier was worth keeping happy. The answer starts there, and it's stranger than the leaflet. In a warehouse outside Bremen, in the last full year of the war, a quartermaster signed for tobacco that was mostly not tobacco. The paperwork called it Tabakersatz. What arrived in the crates was a blend of real leaf, stretched with beech shavings, dried clover, and whatever the processors could press into a burnable cylinder. The Reich had been thinning its cigarettes since before Stalingrad, and by this point, the arithmetic on the ledger was brutal. A soldier's official ration had dropped to 6 cigarettes a day where it existed at all, and at the front it often didn't exist. Germany never grew enough tobacco. That's the root of it. The Reich imported the bulk of its leaf from the Balkans and Turkey, and every mile the front lines moved, and every ship the Allies sank, pulled that supply thinner. When the Romanian oil fields and their trade routes came under pressure, tobacco rode the same collapsing logistics as everything else, and it lost every priority fight to fuel, to ammunition, to food. A general staff that had to choose between shells and cigarettes chose shells, which is the correct military decision, and also the exact decision that put a man on his belly in the Hurtgen mud, reaching for a lucky strike. The Wehrmacht rationed tobacco by decree, cut the ration again, then cut it for anyone not in a combat zone, then handed out coupons that could not be filled. Picture it from inside a lancer's tunic. Nicotine is a chemical dependency, not a preference, and the German soldier of 1944 had been a smoker through 5 years of war. The army knew this. Tobacco had been issued as a stimulant, a nerve steadier, a thing you gave a man before he went over the top. The same reason every army in that war treated cigarettes as quiet ammunition. Then the supply failed. Men traded bread for cigarettes on the black market at rates that horrified the paymasters, a sign of dependency so open that the authorities kept issuing regulations against it and kept failing to stop it. A captured German officer, interrogated on the Western Front, put the shortage plainly. "The men would do a great deal for a cigarette," he said, and the interrogator did not have to press him on what a great deal covered. Set the two supply chains side by side, and the contrast tells the story. On the German side, adulterated leaf, a shrinking ration, coupons redeemable for nothing, and a black market the state could not suppress, 6 cigarettes a day on paper, often 0 in the mud. On the American side, the U.S. soldier's ration included cigarettes issued free, folded into his C&K rations, sold at the PX for a nickel a pack, and shipped to the theater at a scale of roughly 7 billion cigarettes a month by the peak of the effort. 7 billion. The American army was moving more tobacco every 30 days than the Reich could scrape together for its soldiers in a season. And the Germans knew it, because they searched American dead and American prisoners, and what they found in the pockets told them everything about the war their own newspapers wouldn't. That was the trap closing, and neither side designed it as a weapon at first. The Americans issued cigarettes because their supply system could afford to keep men comfortable, the same abundance that put ice cream and white bread and fresh coffee near the front. The Germans rationed cigarettes because their supply system was strangling. But abundance and scarcity don't stay on their own side of the line when the two armies are 20 meters apart. A German in a foxhole could smell it. The American tobacco carried on the wind, in the enemy trenches, on the leaflets that landed in the snow. His own 6-a-day ration was a memory. Theirs was a pack handed to every prisoner as a matter of routine. The Reich had spent years teaching its soldiers to depend on a drug, then run out of the drug, and left them staring across no man's land at an enemy who had more of it than he could use. The men who planned the surrender leaflets understood exactly what that meant, and they were about to weaponize it on purpose. A leaflet takes about 40 seconds to fall from artillery height into a snowdrift. The Psychological Warfare Division at SHAEF knew that number because it mattered. The shells that carried the paper had to burst high enough to scatter and low enough to land inside the German lines, and getting it wrong meant 1,000 printed promises drifting back over American heads. By late 1944, the division was pushing millions of leaflets a week across the Western Front, fired from 105 howitzers, rigged to spill paper instead of shrapnel, dropped from aircraft, floated on balloons when the wind cooperated. Those numbers came out industrial because the operation was. The content was the interesting part. Early Allied propaganda had leaned on ideology, on the case against Hitler, on the moral argument, and the case against Hitler did not move a grenadier who was cold and hungry and out of tobacco. So the writers changed the pitch. The Passierschein, the safe conduct pass, became the flagship product, printed to look official, stamped with Eisenhower's authority, promising any German who carried it 3 specific things: food, medical treatment for his wounds, and cigarettes. Not the war's outcome, not the fate of the Reich, but a menu. The leaflet listed what a prisoner would eat, and it read like a taunt to a man on ersatz bread, meat, real coffee, and American cigarettes, issued on the same terms as they were issued to American troops. The men who chose that last item had done their homework. Interrogators working the cages fed a steady stream of intelligence back to the leaflet writers, and the interrogation reports kept surfacing the same complaint from captured Germans: the tobacco shortage, the black market, the 6-a-day ration that arrived as nothing. The writers built the product around the weakness the prisoners themselves had named. This is the part that gets lost when people call propaganda a matter of clever slogans. The good leaflet was a piece of market research, and the market had told the researchers exactly what it wanted. Not everyone at headquarters believed it would work, and the skepticism came from serious people whose objections were documented. The argument ran that German troops were disciplined, ideologically hardened, held in line by their officers and by the field police who shot deserters, and that no amount of paper promising a hot meal would crack a Wehrmacht that had fought its way back from Normandy in good order. There was a harder version of the doubt, too, that leaflets simply gave frightened men an excuse they already wanted, and that measuring their effect was impossible because you could never separate the paper from the artillery falling alongside it. Both objections were reasonable. Both were, in the specific case of the tobacco pitch, about to be tested against the Germans themselves. The skeptics had a point about discipline. German field police were real. The penalties for desertion were real, and a soldier caught with a safe conduct pass in his pocket could be shot for it, which meant carrying one was its own act of quiet courage or quiet desperation. Men hid the leaflets in their boots, in their tunic linings, folded small against exactly the search that could kill them. The presence of the pass on a captured man was not proof the pass had worked, but the interrogators kept finding them, worn soft from handling, and a leaflet worn soft from handling has been read many times. The doubt started to break here. The prisoner counts on the Western Front climbed through that winter and into the spring, and the men coming in were increasingly willing to explain themselves to interrogators who offered a cigarette across the table. The interrogation, in other words, opened with a demonstration that the leaflet had told the truth. A German gave up his rifle, crossed the line expecting the promise to be a lie, and the first thing the enemy did was hand him a smoke. Word of that traveled back across no man's land, faster than any counter-propaganda Berlin could print, because it was carried by the most credible messenger available, a man who had done it and lived. The paper made the promise. The prisoner cage kept it. And a Reich that could not answer the promise could not answer the proof either, which is the problem the German officers would sit down and describe, in their own words, once the shooting stopped. A sergeant named in the interrogation report only by his rank and unit came through the cage at 1st Army, with his hands still shaking from the cold, and the first American he met handed him a pack of Camels before asking him a single question. The order of operations was the whole method. The intelligence officers had learned to open with the cigarette, not the clipboard, because a man who has just been proven right about the one promise that pulled him across the line will talk about the promises he was told were lies. And the German soldier had been told a great many lies about what waited on the American side. The Americans shot prisoners, he had been told. The food was a trick. The wounded were left to rot, and surrender meant a slower death than the one the Ivans handed out in the East. Berlin's own propaganda had built that wall, and the wall came down the moment a shivering grenadier was led past stacks of ration crates and pyramids of cigarette cartons that dwarfed anything he had seen issued to a full German company. The interrogators noticed the reaction and wrote it down. Men stopped in the middle of the compound and stared. Some of them wept, and not from fear. The stunned admissions filled the reports. One theme surfaced so often, the interrogators stopped treating it as remarkable. The German prisoner, having been told his enemy was starving and running on fumes, walked into a supply dump that told him his own high command had been lying about the balance of the war for years. If the Americans could hand a captured enemy his own carton of cigarettes on the day of his capture, the tobacco shortage he had lived inside was not bad luck or a temporary disruption of the Balkan trade. It was proof of who was winning. A soldier could do that arithmetic faster than any staff officer, and the interrogators watched him do it in real time, across a folding table, with a lit Camel between his fingers. Listen to what the cage sounded like. Trucks idling at the receiving point, the diesel note of an economy that never ran short of fuel. The rip of cardboard as cartons came open. Voices in 3 or 4 dialects of German trading, the one commodity that now flowed toward them instead of away, because cigarettes became currency inside the wire the same day they stopped being propaganda outside it. A prisoner who drew more than he smoked could trade the surplus for a razor, for chocolate, for a better bunk, and the internal economy of the American cage ran on tobacco the way the outside war ran on oil. Kramer's work on German prisoners in America documents exactly this. cigarettes as the medium of exchange behind the wire, a hard currency issued to men who had crossed the line to get it. The golden line came from an interrogator's own summary of what he kept hearing. "They could not believe we gave them to us for nothing," one report noted of the prisoners and the cigarettes, "and the grammar is clumsy because the officer was writing fast, but the meaning is clean. The abundance itself was the interrogation. It did the work no threat could have done, because it answered the question the German had carried across no man's land: was the promise real? Before he was asked to answer any question of his own. That is the second payoff, and it is bigger than the first. The leaflet got a man to crawl. The cage turned him into a source. An enemy who arrives already convinced that his own side lied about the material facts of the war is an enemy who will confirm the order of battle, the state of his unit's supply, the morale of the men still in the line behind him. American intelligence on the Western Front ran partly on that conversion, and the fuel for it was a 5-cent pack handed across a table. The Wehrmacht had spent years teaching a man that the enemy had nothing. The enemy then sat him down, gave him more than he had seen in a year, and let the contradiction do the talking. No interrogator had to break him. The carton had already done it before the first question. A rumor moves through a rifle company faster than any dispatch from division. That was the mechanism the German command never found a countermeasure for, because the thing crossing back over no man's land was not a leaflet they could shoot down, or a broadcast they could jam. It was a fact, carried in the mouths of men who had gone across and were seen alive. The German army fought in a landscape of small units that knew each other. A grenadier had a cousin 2 positions over, a friend from training in the next company, a runner who moved between command posts and talked. When a man vanished into American lines and word filtered back that he was eating meat and smoking camels behind the wire, that word did not stay put. It traveled the informal network the Wehrmacht ran on, the same whisper chain that spread every dark joke and every complaint about the ration, and it arrived carrying more authority than anything Berlin printed. The intelligence problem now turned against the Germans. Their own field police could stop a leaflet. They could search a tunic, confiscate a safe conduct pass, shoot the man carrying it, and they did. But they could not confiscate a story that had already been told around a stove. The counter-propaganda from division ran the other way. The Americans torture. The Americans shoot. Do not believe the paper. And it collided head-on with the testimony of men everyone in the company had known by name. One of those 2 sources had a face. The other had a rubber stamp. The interrogation reports track the shift, and the interesting part is how the reason for surrender changed over the winter. Early prisoners talked about being cut off, overrun, out of ammunition, the ordinary arithmetic of a collapsing front. Later prisoners increasingly described a decision. They had heard what waited on the other side, weighed it, and picked their moment. A night patrol, a gap in the line, an officer's back turned, and gone. Surrender stopped being what happened to a man when his position fell and became something he planned in advance, quietly, sometimes for days. The first payoff of this section is subtle. The tobacco pitch had done something no artillery barrage could do. It had converted surrender from a failure into a strategy. A man who plans his own capture is a man whose army has already lost him, whether he crosses the line that week or not. The discipline that held the Wehrmacht together depended on the soldier believing that the space behind the enemy was worse than the space in front of him. Once the whisper chain proved otherwise, that belief had a hole in it, and holes in a front line spread. The Germans understood the mechanism well enough to fear it. Units with a reputation for going over were broken up, mixed with hard cases, watched. Officers were told to tighten the field police net and to counter the atrocity of enemy leaflets with reminders of what the Ivans did to prisoners in the East, which worked, because the Eastern Front really was a death sentence, and a man who might crawl toward a warm American cage would die in his hole before surrendering to the Red Army. The threat only functioned where the whisper chain had nothing to say. In the West, it had too much. The bigger payoff is the one the whole structure has been building toward. The American cigarette did not win a battle. It did something harder to see and worse to suffer. It planted a rational, self-interested calculation inside the individual German soldier, one that no order could reach and no propaganda could overwrite, because it was validated by the most trusted witness a frightened man has, someone like himself who had already done the thing and come out better for it. The Reich had built its army on the promise that the enemy offered nothing but death. The enemy answered by offering a meal, a doctor, and a smoke, and then let the enemy's own soldiers carry the correction home. By the spring, the safe conduct passes in the mud were being read not as enemy tricks, but as instructions, and a soldier folding one into his boot was no longer a deserter in his own mind. He was a man with a plan and a return address. 340 billion cigarettes. That is roughly what American industry produced for military use across the war years, and the number is worth sitting with, because a German soldier could not. He came from an economy that had rationed tobacco down to a wartime myth, and the figure he collided with in the cage was not a figure at all. It was pallets. It was a warehouse in Antwerp, stacked to the rafters, with a product his own quartermaster signed for, in imitation leaf, and the gap between those two facts was the whole war compressed into a paper tube. The system behind the pack ran on a logic the Wehrmacht never managed to model. Cigarettes were not a luxury the American army tolerated. They were rationed cargo, shipped with the same seriousness as ammunition, folded into the C ration and the K ration and the field issue, moved across the Atlantic in the same holds that carried the shells and the trucks and the aviation fuel. The Quartermaster Corps treated morale as a supply problem with a numerical answer, and the answer was abundance so total it could be spent on the enemy without anyone noticing the cost. A pack handed to a prisoner did not come out of a soldier's ration. There was no subtraction. That was the part the German mind could not close its hands around. What that abundance actually required was staggering. A cigarette in a First Army cage in the Hurtgen had been rolled in a factory in North Carolina, boxed, railed to a port, loaded, convoyed across a submarine ocean, unloaded at a captured harbor, trucked forward over roads the engineers had rebuilt, and issued to a clerk who tore the carton open in front of a shivering man who 3 days earlier had been trying to kill him. Every link in that chain was a thing the Reich had lost the ability to do. The ocean belonged to the American Navy. The sky over the supply roads belonged to the American Air Forces. The trucks, the deuce and a halfs running the red ball routes, existed in numbers that made the German horse-drawn tail look like something out of the previous century, which it partly was. The cigarette was the last inch of a system, and the system was the message. The whole thing resolves at this point. The German soldier had been asked, since Bremen, to believe two contradictory stories. Berlin told him the enemy was starving, that the Reich was holding, that the shortage in his own pocket was a temporary hardship shared by both sides. His own hands told him something else the moment the carton hit the table. The tobacco he could not get was being handed to him for free by the people he had been told were losing, and no amount of discipline could argue with the weight of a full pack against an empty ration tin. The contradiction did not require an interrogator. It sat in his palm, and it smelled like Virginia, sweet and real and utterly foreign after 2 years of scorched ersatz, and a man does not disbelieve his own nose. That smell was the climax of the argument the leaflet had opened. The Psychological Warfare Division had promised a menu. The Quartermaster Corps delivered it, at scale, without strain, and the delivery itself proved every claim Berlin had built its war on to be a lie. The enemy was not starving. The enemy had so much that it could feed its prisoners better than the Reich fed its frontline troops, and the soldier who worked that out had crossed a line no field police could drag him back over. He had stopped believing his own side. The abundance was the weapon, not the taste, not even the nicotine, but the fact that it existed in a quantity that made a mockery of everything he had been ordered to defend. A country that could hand 340 billion cigarettes to its army and still have enough left over to press them on the men it captured, was a country that had already answered the only question that mattered on that frozen front. The German understood it the way you understand a thing you cannot undo. He held the proof in his fingers, lit it, and breathed in the exact measure of how badly his side had been beaten. By the spring of 1945, the numbers stopped reading like casualty reports and started reading like a census. Whole divisions came in with their weapons stacked. The counting apparatus that SHAEF had built to process a steady trickle of prisoners buckled under a flood, and the men who had designed the leaflet campaign watched a projection they had been mocked for turn into a logistics emergency. Remember who had done the mocking. The Psychological Warfare Division had spent the first years of its existence arguing for its own budget against officers who thought paper was a waste of shell casings. The line inside the theater staff ran along familiar grooves. Real armies win with fire, and you do not talk a Wehrmacht grenadier out of a war. His sergeant will shoot him for leaving. There is a documented condescension in the early correspondence, the tone of professionals humoring a novelty act. Leaflets were tolerated because they were cheap, not because anyone with stars believed a printed menu could move a front. Then the front moved. The prisoner totals for the Western Theater in the final months ran past anything the operational plans had assumed. Hundreds of thousands, then past 1 million, funneling into cages that had to be improvised out of open fields because no one had built enough wire. The Ruhr pocket alone closed on a number of German soldiers, larger than most of the armies that had started the war. And the interrogators kept asking the same intake question, kept logging the same answers, and the answers kept naming the leaflet, the rumor, the promise of food, and a smoke and a doctor. The safe conduct pass turned up folded in boot after boot, carried across the line by men who had planned the crossing for days. Now, a caution the records force on anyone honest about this. Armies do not collapse for one reason, and the tobacco pitch was never the whole story. The Reich was being crushed by fire and steel from three directions at once, its cities burning, its fuel gone, its command structure fracturing under a leadership that shot its own generals. A man who surrendered in April of 1945 was reading the war correctly with or without a leaflet in his pocket. The propaganda planners never claimed to have won the war. They claimed something narrower and, in the cage data, defensible, that when a German soldier had already decided the war was lost, the promise of decent treatment decided which way he walked and how soon, and whether he brought his squad. The vindication is real, and it is quieter than a triumph. The post-war assessments went looking for whether the paper had mattered, and the surveys of prisoners came back with a figure the planners could hold up. A substantial share of captured Germans said they had read the leaflets, and a meaningful fraction said the leaflets had affected their willingness to keep fighting or to give up. The exact percentages vary by which study you read, and the studies were run by the people who had a stake in the answer. So the honest move is to hold the numbers loosely, but the direction is not in doubt. Men who had been told the enemy was starving surrendered in the millions to an enemy handing out cigarettes, and they said so, on the record, to the officers writing it down. The brass had wanted a weapon that killed. What they got was a weapon that subtracted, that peeled soldiers off the line before the shooting reached them, that turned the last reserve of German resistance, the will to stand and fight, into a resource that drained faster than fuel. An army that has stopped believing its own government about the basic facts of the war is an army already half defeated in the space between a man's ears, and no amount of field police discipline refills that tank. The dam did not break in one place. It broke everywhere along the Western Front at once. In the arithmetic, each individual soldier had been running since he first smelled real tobacco across a folding table. The planners who had been humored were now processing the proof by the trainload. And the single cheapest item in the American supply catalog, the 5-cent pack nobody in the Quartermaster Corps had thought to guard, had helped empty the trenches of the most professional army in Europe. 59,000 recorded conversations. That is the scale of what the microphones at Trent Park and Fort Hunt pulled out of the walls, hidden in the light fixtures and the fireplaces and the garden benches, where captured German generals strolled and complained, believing themselves unheard. The British and American teams who ran those houses were not chasing tobacco. They wanted order of battle, rocket programs, the location of factories. What they also caught, almost as a byproduct, was the sound of the Wehrmacht's senior officers explaining to each other why their men had stopped fighting. And the explanation, spoken in private among professionals with nothing left to sell, matched the intake forms in the cages almost word for word. The generals could not say it to a microphone they knew about. That is why the hidden ones matter. In their formal FMS reports, written after the war for the American Historical Division, they reached for dignified language. They wrote about Materialsschlacht, the battle of materials, the American superiority in artillery and air and supply. A defeated professional could live with that version. Beaten by tonnage is not the same shame as beaten by comfort. General after general filed studies attributing the collapse to firepower, to the Jabos overhead, to a logistics tale they could not match, and every word of it was true, and none of it was the whole truth. Behind the walls, the tone changed. The transcripts Sönke Neitzel pulled from the archives catch officers talking about morale in terms no formal report admitted. The men no longer believed. The young ones surrendered at the first chance. The promise of good treatment on the other side had done something discipline could not undo. One captured general, recorded in his own careless privacy, put the collapse of the front not on shells, but on the simple fact that his soldiers had come to prefer the enemy's captivity to their own army's future. That is a heavier admission than any casualty figure. A man beaten by a bigger gun keeps his honor. A man whose soldiers walked toward the enemy because the enemy fed them better has lost something the FMS reports were built to hide. The whole script has been climbing toward this resolution. The riddle from the Hurtgen, how a professional army fighting like cornered animals could be pried loose by tobacco, answers itself in the gap between what the generals wrote and what they said when they thought no one was listening. Firepower explained the destruction. It did not explain the surrenders. You do not need a leaflet to make a man run from a barrage. You need one to make him plan his own capture for days, fold the pass into his boot, and walk toward the muzzles with his hands rising, because he had been promised a meal and a smoke and a doctor, and the promise had been kept in front of witnesses he trusted. Heinz Guderian, no propagandist for the Allies, put the material side of it plainly in his memoir. We were fighting an enemy whose resources were, for practical purposes, unlimited. He meant the tanks and the shells. But unlimited resources are also what let an army spend a 5-cent pack on the men it captured without feeling the cost. And the German soldier read that abundance in his palm long before Guderian read it on a map. The enemy who could afford to be generous to his prisoners had already answered the question the whole Reich rested on. The generals in the wired houses understood this. It is why the admission stayed off the official page and surfaced only in the transcripts, where a beaten professional, walking a garden he did not know was bugged, told another beaten professional the truth neither would sign his name to. The microphones caught the sound of an army admitting it had lost its men before it lost its ground, not to a weapon that killed, to one that offered and delivered, and let the offer travel home in the mouths of the men it had already saved. The Quartermaster Corps never fired a round. It moved cargo at a scale no other nation on earth could touch, and the cheapest item on its manifest reached into the most disciplined army in Europe and pulled the will to fight out through a folding table in the snow, one full pack at a time. In the Deutsche Marktkantine after the war, a single American cigarette bought what a day's wages could not. The Reichsmark had died on its feet, and in the rubble of the cities that had ordered men to fight to the last round, the currency that replaced it came in packs of 20, stamped Lucky Strike and Chesterfield and Camel. A carton could rent a room. A carton could buy a woman's wedding ring, a professor's library, a Leica camera off a man who had photographed the Eastern Front. The occupation authorities logged the exchange rate the way a treasury logs gold. The thing the Wehrmacht grenadier had crawled across the mud to get was now the hardest money in Central Europe, and the irony would have been funny to him if he had lived in a country where anything was funny yet. The planners never designed that part, and could not have. The cigarette outlived the state that had failed to produce it. The Reich lasted 12 years and promised 1,000. The pack of camels, a First Army clerk tossed across a folding table in the Hurtgen, was still legal tender in Frankfurt, 3 years after the man who signed for Tabakersatz in Bremen had run out of a war to sign anything for. The lesson, if the word fits, was never really about tobacco. Tobacco was the delivery mechanism. What crossed no man's land in the spring of 1945 was information, packaged in a form a starving man could hold and smell and trust, and the information was that the other side had so much it did not have to count. Abundance was the argument. The Quartermaster Corps had not set out to fight a psychological war, and the men who did fight it were still being humored in 1943. But an economy that could roll 340 billion cigarettes and spend the surplus on its prisoners had built a weapon into its own excess, and the weapon worked precisely because it looked like generosity instead of ordnance. The proof was never American, and that is why it holds up. Anyone can film his own factories and call it superiority. The Reich did exactly that. Newsreel after newsreel of tanks rolling off lines that were already running short of everything. What could not be faked was the enemy's testimony, and the enemy testified in every register available to him. In the intake forms, he named the leaflet. In the cages, he asked for the smoke before the question. Through the microphones at Trent Park, a general in a bugged garden explained to another general why the front had dissolved. And in the post-war market, he priced everything he owned against the item he had once been told the enemy could not afford. 4 separate archives, 4 different kinds of German voice, all saying the same thing without coordination and mostly without meaning to. Historians still argue the weighting. The surveys were run by interested parties. The transcripts are a sample. The market rate is anecdote piled into economics. Some of the exact figures stay soft, and a few of the intake reports were filed by men who wanted the leaflet campaign to look good. Fair enough. Hold the numbers loosely. The direction has never wobbled, because it does not depend on any single document surviving intact. Meanwhile, the war did not stop to admire its own conclusion. The morning the German private lit his camel in the cage, a supply convoy was already grinding east out of Antwerp with the next load, cartons stacked between the shell crates, because the men who ran the Red Ball did not know they were fighting a psychological campaign and would not have slowed down if they had. A clerk somewhere was tearing open the next carton for the next batch of prisoners walking in with their hands up. And a quartermaster officer was filing the requisition for the following week's tobacco allotment, a routine form, a number in a ledger, the cheapest line on the manifest, and the one that had helped hollow out the finest army in Europe. He signed it, dated it, and moved to the next page. There were, after all, more Germans coming in tomorrow, and every one of them would want to smoke.